Welcome everyone for this AHA video where we are recapping some of the key trials from the ACC scientific sessions. And today a personal pleasure to be joined by my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Darren McGuire, who was the presenter of the SOUL trial, which was one of the early late breakers in the first session, and for good reason. Darren, excited to do this with you today. And I know you've done a gazillion interviews, so I'm going to shortcut this for you and just remind people briefly about the trial and have you fill in the blanks here. But, you know, we have a large number of individuals with type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, 9,600 or so. But before I even get into that, give me the background, because we did have Pioneer 6, which was a trial with oral semaglutide previously. So where does this fit in, and what gap is it filling?
Yeah, I'll even take one step further back. So, semaglutide has been proven effective for people with type 2 diabetes, first for glucose control and subsequently shown cardiovascular efficacy. So it has product label indications for both of those. And semaglutide, along with a couple other members of the GLP-1 receptor agonist class, also with proven efficacy, have risen to level 1A indication for people with type 2 diabetes with or at high risk for ASCVD. All of these therapies have been injectables, once daily for liraglutide, once weekly for dulaglutide and semaglutide. But a lot of patients don't want to take a shot, and they have indication, they have access, but they just won't inject themselves. And a lot of prescribers are hesitant to inject themselves. And so there's really an unmet clinical need for that population of patients who need the medication, can get it, but just don't want to take a shot. So having an oral option is really important. And you mentioned the Pioneer 6 trial. I'll even take one step back from that as well. So oral semaglutide is approved for use for type 2 diabetes for glucose control, and it has a claim of cardiovascular safety. And that safety claim comes from the Pioneer 6 trial. That was a smaller trial, a dedicated cardiovascular outcomes trial, but it was designed just to prove safety, but not efficacy. And as you know, in this field, having safety but not efficacy is not a big win, right? And so we wanted to see if delivering this medication through a tablet could achieve anywhere close to the efficacy that we've seen with the injectables. And so that sets the stage for the SOUL trial, where we studied oral semaglutide versus placebo in high-risk patients for cardiovascular disease, with a primary outcome of cardiovascular superiority, not just safety. And so we're taking this one step ahead. So SOUL is about 3 times as big and about twice as long as the Pioneer 6 trial. And we set out to definitively answer the question, is it incrementally beneficial?
I think it's really important to frame it for people that are, following this, that, we had data, but to your point, it was really about safety in a really small number. And there's always the play of chance. So to do a dedicated trial looking at cardiovascular efficacy, quite important to give us more in our armamentarium. So, all told, these individuals followed for about 48 months and 14% relative risk reduction in MACE. So really an important finding, and we'll talk about the meta-analysis in a second. So I think that's, obviously the main take home is that we always go through the tea leaves a little bit through these trials. And, we're always cautious. I know you always have taught me being very cautious about secondary analyses, but talk to me a little bit about some of the secondary outcomes and your interpretation.
Yeah, so the primary outcome, as you mentioned, was a 14% relative risk reduction. And it's important to understand. So these persons were treated open label for glucose control, and they were really well treated for their cardiovascular risk. The LDL, the blood pressure, antiplatelet therapy use, statin use, it was state of the art. And so our findings are on top of all of that. So we went on that, and we had our hierarchical analysis plan, preserving the p-value. And so the prioritized secondary confirmatory outcome was a 5-point composite kidney-related outcome. And although it was directionally positive, it was a point estimate of 0.91, so a 9% point estimate of relative risk reduction, but not achieving statistical significance. And so in the hierarchy, since that failed significance, everything else is exploratory. The third outcome, the second confirmatory outcome, was cardiovascular death alone, again, directionally favorable, a point estimate of 0.93 or 7% relative risk reduction, again, not achieving significance. The confidence intervals overlap unity. But I think one of the most exciting findings we have is the last of the 3 is which was a peripheral arterial disease outcome, which is acute or chronic limb ischemia requiring hospitalization. And that yielded a point estimate of 0.71, a 29% relative risk reduction that was nominally significant. The confidence intervals excluded unity. The purist statistically will say, well, that's an exploratory finding and a hypothesis generating, and I won't contend that. But I think it's probably a real finding. And in lockstep, as you know, the STRIDE trial was presented at this meeting also, which was a dedicated PAD trial led by Dr. Mark Banaka. And they also found a statistically significant reduction in clinical events in that trial, although it was very small and not powered for that. And so we're already embarking on a meta-analysis of these two trials. We use the same endpoint definition, the same adjudication committee. So it's going to be a pretty robust data set where we'll have individual patient level data to meta-analyze. But I think it's a real exciting finding that PAD has moved. This is the first PAD intervention, if it's true, in probably 30 years, and the first one to show clinical efficacy on peripheral disease. As you know, PAD studies typically are driven by their cardiovascular composite events driven by myocardial infarction, even though it's a PAD population. So I think that's pretty exciting, but getting back to the primary outcome, the point estimate of 0.86 or 14% relative risk reduction maps precisely onto the meta-analysis of the prior injectable drugs. And so this puts oral semaglutide squarely in the toolbox. It's just another effective GLP-1 receptor agonist.
Well, just to pick up on some of the things you said, first this consistency. So that's really important. And also, even though maybe not statistically significant, but consistent renal effects that we're seeing, at least, directionally. But the male outcomes, the limb events, sort of serendipitously with STRIDE, really warrant further exploration. As you know well, there's only one class 1 indication right now with cilostazol, and really not a whole lot for limb events as we think about morbidity related to it. So would definitely want to see more. I have to say, you and I were talking, you did the trifecta, you had 3 publications at once. I want to dig into some of the others. One of the things that comes up a lot is in patients that are on SGLT2 inhibitors. We know these are, again, for patients with ASCVD and with chronic kidney disease, are tried and true part of our armamentarium. And so now added on, you did a sub-analysis looking at those on and not on SGLT2 inhibitors. Tell us a little bit about that finding.
Yeah, it's a great point. And our trial had the highest prevalence of SGLT2 inhibitor use at baseline than any GLP-1 receptor agonist trial. So we had over 25% of patients entering the trial were already on an SGLT2 inhibitor. During the trial, 50% of patients were treated with SGLT2 inhibitors. And taking one step back, I was on the writing committee for the ESC guideline for diabetes, and we took one step further from any other prior guideline, and we took out the and or from the GLP-1 receptor agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors. And I want people to think about these medications like we think about HFrEF drugs. We don't say and or for RAS inhibition and beta blockers and MRAs and SGLT2 inhibitors. It's all of it, right? They all work through different mechanisms. They've all been shown effective on the backdrop of the others. And so I think that's where we are. That's where we went with the guideline in 2023. And our data support that pretty robustly. So in Circulation, we published a deep dive using all kinds of analytical tricks to adjust for non-randomization. So we did at baseline treated, ever treated, and most importantly, time updated covariable analysis assessing the SGLT2 inhibitor use. So if people were on it, they were in the on it group, and if they stopped it even for a little bit, they went into the other group. And so time dependent exposure. And what we found across every analysis was the same. There was absolutely no impact on the efficacy of oral semaglutide with or without SGLT2 inhibitors. So I think it provides really strong evidence that we just have to think about these independently. They work through different mechanisms. They're complementary, and there's no interaction of treatment efficacy.
So at least 2 pillars of therapy now, as we think about
Right.
FRF. So last question for you. You made a point which is really interesting in the discussion. It came up that oral versus injectable semaglutide, and what do you recommend with your patients in follow up from this study? And you were pretty definitive that you'd still do injectable. First, explain that to me, given that the efficacy, to your point, in the meta-analysis is spot on. Why is that?
Yeah, not getting into the weeds about it, but we've never before been able to give a small peptide through the GI tract, right? So this is a novel technology that Novo Nordisk, the sponsor of the trial, developed. And they developed a tablet that has a molecule excipient that's called SNAC, SNAC, and I'm not going to even pretend to know what that stands for. But it renders the tablet sticky in an acidic environment. So it gets into the stomach, becomes sticky, sticks to the gastric mucosa, and at the point of contact is the only place where the drug is delivered. It develops a buffered zone right around the point of contact and delivers the peptide through the gastric mucosa into the bloodstream. This delivery is only 0.8% bioavailable. So that means 99.2% of the drug in the tablet is excreted in the feces. So it's a really inefficient mechanism of delivery, although and we've shown it, and they've shown it before in other trials, that it actually gets enough drug into the body to mimic an injectable. But the bioavailable, so you have to take the drug early in the morning, fasting, no more than 4 ounces of liquid, and you can't eat or drink anything for 30 minutes. And one big question in this trial, we weren't questioning really the efficacy of semaglutide, but the method of delivery. And so what we showed in this 9,650 person trial, that on average, people can get the medicine. It's demonstrated by the efficacy shown for 3-point MACE. We also have cardiometabolic measures. Hemoglobin A1C was statistically reduced, weight was statistically reduced, and CRP was. And so on average, people actually got the medicine. And that was really important in a large trial, making it generalizable, right? So people can take this medicine, maybe not perfectly, but the bottom line is that all of this variability in the bioavailability is rendered mute when you inject it. It's 100% bioavailable when it's injected. And so I would choose the injection over the tablet every time I could. But for, we have, it's estimated somewhere around 50% of patients who have indication and access, 50% refuse to take a shot. Personal story, I take injectable semaglutide. The needles are so small, it's not that they don't hurt, you simply can't feel them enter the skin. It's almost laughable how resistant people are to take this shot, but we have them 50% probably. And so for those persons, we now have an oral option that we know will mimic the efficacy of the injectables. And to your point, you mentioned the meta-analysis. We also published in Diabetes Care an updated meta-analysis, now including the SOUL data. Our trial results mimicked the point estimate and the confidence limits of the prior meta-analysis of the class. And so we put this drug spot on the line of the class effect of GLP-1 receptor agonists with an oral formulation.
Well, listen, I think you said it right. We have a new, more confidence in an oral option. It is an option now, and we need a broad toolkit because patients are not getting adequate treatment. So congratulations to you and all your co-investigators. What an important trial that, rightfully was on the first day, and we'll hear a lot more coming from the SOUL investigator. So thank you for your time, Darren, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
All right. Thank you, Amit.